Okay, so I just thought I'd do a countdown list of all the X-Men films. I'm going to rank them from worst to best because I just recently watched all of them, like within the span of the last week, including Dark Phoenix. And I was scrolling online and I kept seeing worst to best lists of the X-Men movies, and I wasn't really agreeing with many of them. There's one thing I agreed with most of them, but we'll get to that. I also kept Deadpool 1 and 2 off the list because even though it is set in the X Men universe and you get little cameos from the X Men in those films, I just don't think it matches the tone of the rest of the X Men universe. And Deadpool's more of a parody of the X Men, so I thought I'd just leave it at the list. Even though I think Deadpool's funny, I just think it's easier to rank 10 movies instead of 12. Anyway, let's get into it. Now, a lot of you are probably going to disagree with me on this first one. I'm going to go number 10, the worst X-Men film. And you might just click off this video when you hear this, but the worst X-Men movie, in my opinion, is
another stage of human evolution.
The truth is that mutants are very real, and they are among us. We must know who they are, and above all, what they can do.
X-Men 1. And that might be blasphemy for some people to hear, but just hear me out on this. I've rewatched this movie now 3 times this week, and it's the least enjoyable out of all the X-Men films, and I've watched all of them. It's the most dated. It's probably the smallest story out of all the movies. It has a horrible set piece with the Statue of Liberty. Doesn't look good anymore. And the Sabretooth Wolverine stuff in the movie doesn't work for me because they never acknowledge that they're brothers. And they did that on purpose because they didn't think they were going to get more X-Men movies. This is a time where superhero movies were still a risk and everything. And most people give this movie a pass because it's the one that started it all. You know, without the first X-Men movie being a box office success, you don't get the MCU. You don't get Warner Brothers trying to reignite their superheroes again. At least it doesn't happen as fast as it does, right? Without X-Men 1. And that's usually the reason why people rank this movie high. But I don't judge movies based off the shit that's surrounding the movie. I judge it based off whether or not I enjoyed watching it. And the first X-Men movie, I really don't. It's quite boring. It's a really boring film. The best stuff in the movie is Wolverine. And even that, it's Hugh Jackman in his first attempt as the Wolverine. And he's not quite comfortable yet. You know, you could tell he just doesn't quite know what the character is. And he's still one of the best parts of the movie. But yeah, if I'm going to rewatch all the X-Men films, this is the last one I would rewatch. It's the one I would skip. And pretty much the only reason to watch this movie is to see the New York set piece at the end with the Statue of Liberty because they reference it in Logan. So that's really the only reason to watch the first X-Men movie. And Rogue is just horrible. Like, Rogue is the worst character. So boring to watch her. There's a reason why they cut down her role in the second movie and the third movie, because she really brings the movie to a grinding halt. So for all that, I have to say X-Men is the worst out of the X-Men franchise. People give it a lot of passes because it started everything. But when you look at it as a film, it's quite boring. It's not nearly as enjoyable as the other X-Men films. And it's the one I'm least likely to rewatch. So moving on to number 9, I have
You even know how to kill me. I'm gonna cut your head off. See if that works.
X-Men Origins Wolverine, which I just did a live stream with, watch party with. I watched the whole movie live. And to be honest, the movie does go by pretty fast. There's some cool moments in the film. Sabretooth is excellent. The actor playing Sabretooth is perfect. I love that they do the brother connection with them. And, you know, that first opening montage in the movie where they're going through all the wars, that's pretty cool. And the first 2/3 of the movie are good. You know, the first 2 acts are solid. There's not really much to complain about. It's really the last act, in the last 15 minutes especially, that the movie just crumbles apart. I don't know if this last bit was reshot. You know, it kind of looks like it was reshot because the CG even looks worse in the last third of the movie, when they're fighting on top of the nuclear reactor and stuff. When Deadpool's fighting Wolverine, it just looks really bad for some reason. And Deadpool himself in that scene, yeah, almost destroyed the franchise. Almost destroyed the X-Men franchise, almost destroyed the Deadpool character. But, with the Deadpool movies, they actually make fun of that scene. So really, you kind of have to watch this movie now. You kind of have to watch X-Men Origins Wolverine to understand why Deadpool is so much better and to get the references to this movie. But yeah, it's definitely one of the weaker X-Men films, but I had a enjoyable time watching it. I liked it better than the original X-Men. It felt like Hugh Jackman was really comfortable as Wolverine by this time, and I enjoyed every second that he was on screen, which he's on screen the whole movie. So some stuff in the movie I didn't like, especially in the end. But most of the movie is fine to watch. It's just that last third that kind of ruined the movie, really. And just like with the rest of the X-Men films, it fucks up the timeline even more. And that's the thing about these films. The timeline makes zero sense, even when you try to put it all together. And this movie especially kind of fucks that up too. But still, you get an origin of Wolverine. You get to see him get the metal claws. It's kind of cool to see him go from bone claws to metal claws. But that's about it. Now, number 8 on my list.
I break things.
Well, how's this sound? If you break something, I can fix it.
I have a school for young people who are like you, G. We could be your new family.
I got X-Men Dark Phoenix. Now, I've kind of been coming around on this film. When I first saw it, I fucking hated it. But I watched it a couple more times since, and I'm liking it a little bit more. Especially for the Hans Zimmer music. That's kind of why I want to rewatch it. Because I just like hearing the music. And there's definitely a couple cool set pieces in the movie. But there's also a lot of questionable acting choices. Like when Raven dies and Beast, does that thing where he can't speak or anything because he's so distraught over her death. I thought that was just bad. That was just cringy beyond belief. Really hysterical to see. And it shouldn't have been funny. That moment should not be funny. But because Beast react the way he does, it makes it hysterical. Couple good action set pieces, but really overall, the theatrical cut of Dark Phoenix is a mess. And I was struggling whether or not to put this at 9 or 8 on the list. Because X-Men Origins, I do enjoy the film. But that last 15 minutes of that film really ruined it for me. But Dark Phoenix, you could see that it could have been a really good movie if some decisions were made differently and they didn't have to cut the movie down and make it a one film instead of a two-parter thing. And maybe an extended cut of this movie will come out that will fix some of these issues I have with it. But right now, it's 8 on the list. It's the third worst X-Men film. The theatrical cut of Dark Phoenix is not that good, but it's still a film. Beginning to end, it's one cohesive story, and it feels like, an X-Men adventure, I guess you could say, where the whole team's involved and stuff. So in that sense, it is an X-Men film, and it's definitely more interesting to watch than the first X-Men film because of the Hans Zimmer music, and at least it's a complete film, unlike X-Men Origins Wolverine, which feels like a total mess in the end. This one, it felt like the ending was one of the best parts in Dark Phoenix. The train sequence, that was one of the best parts of the film, and it's the part they reshot, so they did a good job ending the movie, I guess you could say. But yeah, I have a lot of problems with Dark Phoenix, and maybe an extended cut will change my mind on it, but right now it's at 8. Number 7.
Make no mistake, my brothers. The humans will draw first blood. And the air is still, and the night has fallen.
X-Men Last Stand. Now, this is the other Dark Phoenix movie, and everybody hates this movie, but I understand where they were going with it. It's in the same vein as X-Men 1 and 2. It's the same style, the same type of writing. There's really not much of a difference between X-Men Last Stand and X-Men 2. The only real difference is that X-Men Last Stand has more action scenes, and it's a little bit more epic, especially in the end where Dark Phoenix is tearing apart Wolverine as he's trying to get close to her and he's healing and stuff like that. That stuff is great. And Hugh Jackman, once again, does a great job as Wolverine. But I really feel like this movie is on the same tier as X-Men 2 and X-Men 1. And that's probably blasphemy to say too, but I call it as I see it. X-Men The Last Stand is only slightly worse than X-Men 2. Because number 6 on the list...
Drop the knives and put your hands in the air.
I can't.
Are they the next link in the evolutionary chain? Or simply a new species of humanity fighting for their share of the world?
Is X-Men 2. And from now on in this list, it's just the X-Men films I like to love, you know? And X-Men 2, I really like it. And I really like it for the villain in the film, which is one of the best villains they've ever had in the film, one of the best actors they've had in the entire series. And he makes the movie worth watching. He's great. But I also love it because what you're constantly reminded of throughout the series is Magneto asking Charles Xavier, what are you going to do when they come for your family at the night? That's usually the thing Magneto says to Charles Xavier, warning him about the government and stuff. And in X-Men 2, you see that happen. You see government, military people break into the mansion and take mutants. It's one of the best set pieces in the movie. Other than the beginning set piece at the White House, the mansion set piece is my favorite and definitely a highlight of the movie. Definitely the reason to watch the film because it really feels like a big Waco event, you know, where the government's taking out a civilian house or something. It's really eerie and unexpectedly dark for a superhero film like this because it does feel real. It feels like, yeah, the government would do that if they had to, right? But of course, this film does lack, again, from the same faults that X-Men 1 had. And that is, it's just a little dated. You know, the film itself, the effects are just a little bit dated, especially in the third act with the dam breaking and stuff like that. Cool miniature effects, but I just thought that last third of the movie was a little boring, you know, and the effects didn't look that great. And, you know, the only thing that kept it together for me was the villain of the movie. I really like that actor. But I always tend to get a little bored in the third act of X-Men 2. It's still a good film to watch, though. And I still think it's better than X-Men Last Stand, but it's not by much. It's not like this huge gap that people usually talk about, how X-Men 2 is like this great film and X-Men Last Stand's a total dog shit pile. It's really not like that. I think X-Men 2 is just slightly better than X-Men Last Stand. I don't really feel like there's a big difference, but that's probably just me. Number 5.
Being was born the world's first.
Mutant.
You are all my children, and you're lost because you follow blind leaders.
X-Men Apocalypse. A lot of people hate this film. This film is usually at the bottom of lists like this, but I'm starting to love this film. I've rewatched it probably 5 times in the span of this week, and I really love it because it really does feel like a true X-Men adventure, you know? Wolverine is not the center of the movie. He only has a cameo in this film. So the film is relying on the other X-Men, and it's the first adventures of like Cyclops and Jean Grey and stuff like that. So this is like the first threat they face, and I like that aspect of the movie. I think Oscar Isaac does fine as the villain. He's not the best villain in the series. He's not the worst. He does his job. And the story with Magneto, I really loved. I really loved watching his family die and him killing all those Poland cops. I love that scene in the forest. It might be a little cheesy where he starts like damning God and stuff like that. That stuff might be a little cheesy, but it was still a big epic moment and you feel the emotion. And also, I think X-Men Apocalypse has the best Quicksilver scene in the entire X-Men franchise, and that's when he's saving the mansion and you have that song playing, Sweet Dreams Are Made of This, and the song goes perfectly with the scene, and it makes for probably the best Quicksilver scene in the entire franchise. And it has a nice big epic showdown at the end. You know, giving the X-Men a threat that's worthy of the X-Men, which you don't see happen in these movies a lot. Because most of the other X-Men movies, the enemy they're fighting against is not as world-ending as Apocalypse is. Usually the threat in X-Men movies are just trying to kill mutants. They're not trying to kill everybody in the world. They're just targeting mutants, and that's who the X-Men are fighting to protect mutants. But in Apocalypse, the X-Men are protecting the world. It just felt like a big X-Men story. The scale felt big. It was serious when it needed to be serious, but it was also fun when you need some levity. And Quicksilver did that for me in the movie. And I think James McAvoy does great as Professor X, and Michael Fassbender kills it as Magneto. Like, it felt like more of a continuation of Days of Future Past, which you'll see later where it's on my list. But anyway, let's go on to number 4.
You have struggled long enough. I can end your eternity. Make you mortal.
The Wolverine. directed by James Mangold. And this was his first Wolverine movie. He also would go on to direct Logan, which I also love. But I also am really loving this Wolverine film. I love the setting, Japan. I love the opening in Nagasaki where you see the atomic bomb go off. And you see Wolverine and all his skin is like burned off. It's a really horrific sight to start the movie with. But, I think it's a cool movie. Wolverine's powers, they're not working as well because he has something on his heart. So the Wolverine you see is very humanized and stuff in this movie. He's actually worried about dying. The injuries actually mean something. And eventually in the movie, you get an epic scene where he reaches inside his own chest to fix his heart. And, that's a pretty hardcore scene for a Wolverine X-Men film. And they're really pushing that rating. Like, James Mangold, he wanted to do an R-rated Wolverine film. But he didn't get to do that till Logan. So he had to hold back a little bit for this Wolverine film. And you could tell. But other than that, I like the story being told. It's a very simple, grounded story. Takes place in one setting, the whole movie, Japan. So maybe that's why people think this is like more the forgettable X-Men film. Because it's not like a globe-trotting adventure. But I think it's a solid Wolverine film that is a great watch. Because you get scenes with Jean Grey and Wolverine, like dream sequences. And it ties in nicely to X-Men Last Stand. So it really feels like it's a part of the X-Men universe. While also being a solo Wolverine adventure. Where you actually see Wolverine struggle a little bit. And, I like that aspect of the movie. And I like the setting. And it's a nice, cohesive story. The acting is solid. There's nothing much that's wrong with the film, technically. It's really an enjoyable film. And definitely worth a rewatch if you haven't watched it already. This is probably one of my favorite X-Men films. But I was struggling between Wolverine and Apocalypse. I was like, which one do I like better? So it really is on that same level for me with Apocalypse. It might just be a little bit better because of Hugh Jackman. I just like Hugh Jackman as Wolverine that much. He really brings the life to the movie. So that's probably why I'm going to put it at number 4. Number 3.
You have the chance to become part of something much bigger than yourself.
What do you know about me?
Everything.
X-Men First Class. Now, this was supposed to be the X-Men Origins Magneto movie, but they made it into First Class after that disaster that was X-Men Origins Wolverine. And this is one of my favorite X-Men films of all time. It's going to be tough for any reboot X-Men film to beat these last 3 X-Men films, because I love First Class. I loved all the characters, and I didn't miss Wolverine at all, which is a great sign when you're watching these X-Men films that only have a cameo of Wolverine. If it can make you forget about Hugh Jackman's Wolverine, I think it's a great X-Men film. And it's taking place during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and as it turns out, oh yeah, the mutants are behind that too. And I love this 1960s spy thriller that you get for like the first half of the movie. And I don't care that some characters are changed around and stuff. As long as the story's good, I don't really care what you do with the characters. So yeah, a lot of continuity mistakes come from this movie. The timeline gets real fucked up in this movie, but it doesn't matter because it's such a good movie. Kevin Bacon does a great job as the villain. He's probably the second best villain in the entire X-Men universe. He might actually be the best. It's close. I really enjoyed Kevin Bacon in this role. He's a great reason to watch the movie. You could just tell he's having fun being the villain in this film. And you can actually tell the whole cast is having fun. The whole cast has great chemistry. Jennifer Lawrence looks happy to be there. And I just love seeing the origins of the X-Men. I love seeing Charles Xavier go from a douche college kid to being the leader of the X-Men and getting paralyzed and all that. All that stuff's great to me. And you even get a callback to the first X-Men movie with the Magneto in Auschwitz scene at the beginning of the movie, which is identical to the first X-Men movie. And probably the best thing about the first X-Men movie. But now that you get that scene in this X-Men movie, First Class, there's really no reason to go back and watch the first X-Men movie. So, yeah, I think First Class does a better job at being a first X-Men adventure than the actual first X-Men movie. And in First Class, I think they might have rushed the ending with Magneto going evil, and, taking Raven. They might have rushed that because they probably didn't think they were going to get sequels to this First Class movie. But since the movie did so well, they had to make a sequel. And that sequel was Days of Future Past. And the reason why I think Days of Future Past is so good is because you had such a good beginning movie with First Class that it really made you invested in the next movie, which is number 2 on my list. So First Class was number 3, and number 2 is Days of Future Past.
He's a pain in the ass.
Prison break? That's illegal, you know.
Only if you get caught.
Charles. Good to see you too, old friend.
I love everything about this film. Now, this is a fun superhero film. When people keep talking about fun superhero films, they usually just mean a superhero film that has a bunch of jokes every second. But this, to me, Days of Future Past, was probably the most enjoyment I've ever had watching a superhero team-up film. Way more so than the first Avengers film. This one feels like it has stakes. You see the desolate future, and you see why they have to go back in time. And it's a fun time travel film. Seeing Wolverine having to convince a young Professor X to stop being mopey and get back into the fight. That was some of the most enjoyable parts of the movie. And if you watch the Rogue cut, they had like 10 minutes of them saving Rogue from the mansion. And she is introduced into the movie, which wasn't in the theatrical cut. So I thought that was a cool tie into the other movies. Even though I hate Rogue, and I don't like her character at all, at least she didn't say anything in Days of Future Past. And it was actually a cool nod to see her if you've watched the original X-Men trilogy. And that's what this whole movie acts as. It acts as a huge wink to the audience, essentially telling the audience, yeah, we know all the mistakes we've made with the last X-Men movies, but we also know all the good things we did, and we're going to do all the good things in this movie, and we're going to erase all the bad things, and that's what Days of Future Past does. So if you didn't like, Origins Wolverine, if you didn't like X-Men Last Stand, or X-Men 2, or X-Men 1, this movie kind of erases all of them, and gives you a new timeline. And it tries its best to fix the timeline, but I don't think they actually were able to do it. It's just so fucked up at this point. But it was a valiant effort. I think the villains were cool, but Peter Dinklage wasn't really a villain. I didn't see him as a villain. I just saw him as a guy that thought he was doing the right thing. His motives made sense. Nothing really felt evil about him. And I guess that does make for a good villain. But it really wasn't him that was the villain. It's the Sentinels. It's the machines he creates that become the villains in the future. But the Sentinels in the 70s don't look that good. That's probably the one negative about the film. But the rest is just amazing. All the Magneto scenes are incredible in the future and the past. They're both incredible. Ian McKellen's Magneto, Michael Fassbender, James McAvoy, Patrick Stewart, they all do a fucking phenomenal job in this movie. Hugh Jackman gives his second greatest Wolverine performance in this movie. At least that's how I feel. And the introduction to Quicksilver is incredible. You get a couple awesome Quicksilver scenes and just a great story. An enjoyable story. I can watch the movie over and over. And I think it's the best X-Men team-up film, where you have all these different team members of the X-Men. This is the best one out of all of them. But it's not the best X-Men film, because number one...
Logan, what did you do? Charles, the world is not the same as it was. Mutants. They're gone now.
It's Logan. And Logan is pretty much number one on everybody's list. I know the rest of my list probably looks different than most people, but we can all agree that number one is probably Logan. It should have won Oscars. Hugh Jackman should have won an Oscar. Patrick Stewart should have won an Oscar for Best Supporting. This film is incredible, and it stands the test of time. It has a beautiful Western soundtrack, and it really feels like an outlaw fighting against the inevitable end. At least that's what it feels like with Wolverine. He's just so old and broken in this movie. And the movie is rated R, so these actors can say and do whatever they want in this movie. And a lot of people praise this movie because you actually see Wolverine mess people up with his metal claws, right? You actually finally get to see it in this movie. Him do real damage like that, where he's cutting off limbs and heads. All that's in this movie, and that's why a lot of people praise the movie. But I think it's rated R because of the adult themes that are in the movie and all the adult subtext that's going on in this movie. That's why it's rated R. I mean, the violence, yeah, you get some awesome violence, but the themes of dying and just waiting out the clock, waiting for the end, like that is some heavy stuff. And that's why I think it got the R rating. But I also love the Western feel throughout the movie. And that comes with the Western soundtrack. I love it. There's not really much of a villain. I mean, there is the clone of Wolverine. And yeah, it's cool, but it's really not the point. The real story is between Wolverine and his daughter, Laura, who are doing a road trip, essentially, across the country. That's where the real heart of the movie is. That's why it's so enjoyable to watch it over and over. Yeah, you have your side villains, the guy with the metal arm and the other company guy, they're chasing after them the whole movie. But you really just want to see the story between Logan and his daughter and see Patrick Wilson's Professor X actually start to enjoy life again. Because when you see Professor X at the beginning of the movie, he hates his life being stuck in this water tank all day. And he finally gets to go out and see the world again through the eyes of Laura and stuff. And it's just a beautiful movie. It should have won all kinds of awards. I think anybody can enjoy this film. And you don't have to see any of the other X-Men films. I mean, if you've seen every other X-Men film, then that makes Logan way better. But if you haven't, it doesn't matter because it's that good of a movie on its own. It's a standalone movie. It's that good. You could just watch it and enjoy it and not have to think about this, crazy X-Men universe that has a bunch of splintering timelines that makes zero sense. But anyway, yeah, that's it for my list. I love all these X-Men films except for the last 4. But even the ones I don't like a lot, I still like a little because it's X-Men. And I've watched this franchise since the beginning. And I always get some kind of enjoyment out of the films. Even if I don't like them at all, like Dark Phoenix, there's always something I can pull out of the film that I like. And there's some films that they've made that are absolutely legendary, that are going to stand the test of time, like Logan, and are going to be considered one of the greatest films of all time, up there next to The Dark Knight, That's where Logan is. That's what the X-Men franchise was able to do. And it's a shame it's over now. And it'll be a long time before we get another X-Men film like Logan, or we get another superhero film at all that's like Logan. That's an adult superhero film. I remember when Logan came out and everybody was like, this is going to change comic book films. And it really didn't. There hasn't been another film like Logan that's a superhero film. If anything, Logan was the last. It was the end of that type of superhero film. Until we get, something else. It really is the last one like that. But anyway, yeah, that's it for now. That's my top 10 X-Men films. Logan being the best. The original X-Men being the worst. For me. That's just what it is. But yeah, that's it for now. Comment below, let me know what you think, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye.